The really tricky thing about appreciating Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is that you have to see it through the right set of eyes.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?
Which I must admit I myself did not possess until very recently. The program launched back in the late 60s, an era with its own TV fashions and faces.
I am here!
And while I can't honestly say this happened, I can imagine myself back then clicking around the TV dial and coming across this.
Ready now? Gonna hide behind the armor. Here we go.
And then quickly moving on to something else. For one thing, I was 12 years old at that point, and Mr. Rogers was a baby show. For another, we'll switch back again. Maybe I found something just a little threatening about a man who was so determinedly gentle and soft-spoken.
Now, look. Oh, you're sleeping, aren't you?
When you're 12 and struggling to be cool, one thing you know for sure is that a grown man who puts on colored tennis shoes every day and who feeds the fish every day and who, in that goody-goody voice, sings songs about feelings.
I'm proud of you. I hope that you are proud of you too.
He was definitely not cool. Click and goodbye, Mr. Rogers.
How are you? Everything peaceful in the neighborhood today?
Except Mr. Rogers never said goodbye. He stayed around, and times changed, but he did not.
Let's pretend that it's still nighttime in the make-believe.
And to those viewers who had the right set of eyes, and that means anyone who was 3 or 4 or 5 years old in the 1960s, or the 1970s, or the 1980s, or 1990s, to those viewers, Mr. Rogers became important, huge, a permanent memory. One way we saw that was to meet his train when he visited Washington, D.C. last winter.
How are you?
And to see how long it took before he was recognized. About 9 seconds.
Is that Mr. Rogers?
You're Mr. Rogers.
I am.
You were a great influence on me, and you're an influence on my child as well.
I watched your goodbye on TV and it just brought me to tears.
Oh.
Appreciate all you've done.
These were completely spontaneous testimonials. And you could see that regardless of how old they are today, 14 or 44, people who grew up watching The Neighborhood
Oh, hi, Mr. McFeely.
had all known the same Mr. Rogers, because he's been doing the same thing, regardless of fashions, TV ratings, or the fact that long, long ago he became a
That
star.
video is a work of art in itself, Mr. McFeely.
And now comes this news that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood has ceased production, and you think, wait a minute, can this be the end of Mr. Rogers? And if you're one of his lifelong fans, or even a latecomer like me, which had a lot to do with having children who watch him, you realize there will never be anyone quite like him in children's television again. Sure, he's quirky and not cool, but Mr. Rogers knew what he was doing, and he did it for 34 years, and he did more good in that time than maybe anyone else on television.
When I was a baby owl, I remember how I used to wish I could fly.
And one of the most dramatic examples of that was this episode broadcast in June of 1968. And if the month and year seem vaguely familiar to some, this is why.
Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today,
The nation was watching the Kennedy family prepare to bury another
what he wished
brother.
for others.
Bobby Kennedy had just been assassinated. And here's what happened on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in a special broadcast for kids and their parents.
What does assassination mean? Have you heard that word a lot today? Yes.
I've been terribly concerned about the graphic display of violence which the mass media has been showing recently. And I plead for your protection and support of your young children.
there is just so much that a very young child can take without it being overwhelming.
And if you see what Rogers was getting at that night, that kids need a lot of help in understanding their world, then you see what he did in less dramatic fashion every single day. All those things that scared kids, all those feelings they didn't know what to do with, the confusing things that grown-ups did.
But wartime can be scary time for children.
And the painful things that grown-ups did.
Did you ever know any grown-ups who got married and then later they got a divorce?
Fred Rogers was, for a very long time, the only grown-up on television talking to children about these things. He wasn't a cartoon. He didn't have superpowers. He didn't establish rapport with his audience by being sarcastic or edgy or hip. Rogers figured out it was enough to be gentle and soft-spoken and polite and sincere and reassuring. All qualities that came to him naturally, as we'll see when we return.
I'm fine, thank you. I slept.
Are you ever amazed by the fact that this program turned into an institution and that you've become an icon?
The sages throughout the years have talked essentially about the same thing. And one is, you don't set out to be rich or famous. What you set out to do is to be helpful. If the other comes along with it, that's okay, but that's not what you set out to be.
Rich? Not rich. Famous? Well, it's more like Mr. Rogers is quietly powerful, as we saw when we continued to follow him around Washington. This was the PBS conference that had brought him to town. And watch how virtually everywhere he went, there were people stopping him and telling him that he had been there for them at just the right moment in their lives when they really needed a neighbor.
I want to thank you very much.
On my own behalf and behalf of my adult children, thank you for what you've given to us.
When I was a little girl, there were many confusing messages about white and black and who belonged where, but we knew we belonged with you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Your life reminded me of what it must be like to be the leader in a marathon, in that at every step of the way, people were reacting to you and clapping for you and applauding you. To watch so many people walk up to you and all of them saying two words, thank you, over and over, it was thank you. What are they all thanking you for?
You know, I think that people long to be in touch with honesty, and I wonder if they're not thanking us for just giving ourselves. And I think that people sense that we want to be honest with them. You know, I've told children, and many of these people grew up with the neighborhood. They were children when we started, and now they have children of their own. And many of them know that I would say, this might hurt. You know, if you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you an injection, it might hurt at first, but it won't hurt long. I mean, we're not going to fudge stuff. We're going to tell them the truth, and we're not going to dance around and say how happy things are when they're not. And I have a feeling that that's part of the thank you.
The other thing Fred Rogers never did was to treat children as a marketing opportunity. You could go back to the 1950s, and children's programming never missed that opportunity. Even the venerable Captain Kangaroo.
Buster Brown shoes. Shoes with real grown-up styles that fit your feet the best of any. Say, look here.
I'm just so glad I did it
Buster
that way,
Brown pony. See this?
there's just so much that you need to live on.
Did you grow up feeling that way?
I think so, because My parents and my grandparents were real service-oriented people. When my dad retired, he said to me, I spend 95% of my day doing things for others. And I also remember being in New York with my dad, and he would walk along the sidewalks, and you know, there are a lot of exposed windowsills on the sidewalks in New York, and he would put pennies. He would just place pennies on the windowsills. And I'd say, why do you do that? And he said, I just like to think about the people who will find them.
The town Fred Rogers grew up in was Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He was an only child for many years and has said he was often lonely. But he had his parents and he had his grandparents, and they loved music.
And of course, my grandfather McFeely, well, you know, he played the violin, and I'm sure that's where I get some of my love for music. Even when I was 5 years old, I could go to the piano and be either so sad or so happy.
You could do that at the age of 5?
Yeah, I mean, not exactly like this,
No,
but
but you knew.
I could really cry through the tips of my fingers when I was a kid.
Rogers wrote all the songs he sang on The Neighborhood. He wrote all the scripts. He did most of the puppetry himself. Over the years, has the program in your mind ever been an antidote to everything else that's on television, or to things that are going on in America, especially in childhood America? Have you ever thought of it as the refuge for kids?
I've always thought of myself as a neighbor, an uncle that came to visit and just said, hey, let's spend a half an hour together, you know, I accept you exactly as you are, let's just have some time together. But to think of it as an antidote to other things, you can't help but do that when you read some of the mail, and especially now, when people in their 30s are writing to say, you know, yours was the haven that I felt in my childhood. I didn't know that people treated other people that nice. But I had a letter the other day saying that this woman had been abused and raped as a young child, and she would find her solace in going into a little room that had the television. And she said, I really believed it when you said that people could like me exactly as I was, because I really didn't like myself that much at first. But I really came to believe you. Well, to me, that's a holy enterprise, that the space between the television set and that little girl who was in such desperate need, the space there was holy ground. Something was happening that wasn't in my control. I was just saying what was in my heart, and between that moment and her receiving it was, I think, a mysterious wonder. I guess you're wondering what might be in the big box. Well,
in 1969, much younger and still not well known, Mr. Rogers went to Washington. Public television needed more money. Congress was saying, no way. The legendarily tough Senator John Pastore had never even heard of this gentleman from Pittsburgh until now.
I give an expression of care every day to each child to help him realize that he is unique. I end the program by saying, you've made this day a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you. And I like you
I think
just
it's
the way you are.
I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
And that is another rare thing about Fred Rogers. He is a man who has made his mark while speaking consistently and passionately in soft tones.
It's those of us who are the producers and purveyors of television are servants of the people. And if those who sponsor programs and those who sit on boards of directors of places that own networks, if they would simply watch what's on a lot of their air and say to themselves, do I want my family watching this? I think that the climate would change, and the landscape of television could be what it's meant to be, and that is a landscape of nourishment for the human family.
So why then, after 34 years, is Mr. Rogers hanging up his sweater? Well, actually, he is not. Rogers says his goal all along was to create a library of episodes that would cover all the major issues of child development, and now he has done that. His staff, organized as what is called Family Communications, continues work on other projects, including, they hope, some new uses of the internet.
I have an idea of doing programs for people as they're going to sleep. You know, I would be able to read stories and the children would be able to see the books right on the computer. And I don't know another voice in America that could put people to sleep better than this one.
And then it was time to wrap up, and our cameraman, Danny, just had to ask Mr. Rogers for a snapshot. He said he'd filmed presidents before, but he had never asked for this favor before. And then everybody else took a picture, too. And then I asked for a first-time favor as well. Could Mr. Rogers just look into the camera and say hello to my son, Ben, and my daughter, Noah? Just a hello.
Hello, Ben. Hi, Noah.
Well, Mr. Rogers ran with it. He said hello, and he told them some more stuff about our day together. And then he did them a song.
To get home to you real soon. It's such a good feeling to know you're alive.
And all I could think as I realized how Mr. Rogers had just helped make me a hero to my own kids was, this guy on the piano is cool. Very, very cool.
Snappy new day.
I'm John Donvan for Nightline in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Very good feeling, the feeling you know that we're friends.